Okay. Hi, my name is Maris Kreisman, and I run events and marketing for McNally Jackson, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event for the store. If you go to mcnallyjackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming days and weeks. I'm adding more every day, so please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for your questions. You can use the Zoom chat function to submit any questions you have, and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're so glad that even though we can't all be in the same room, we're still able to host events during this difficult time. And that means tonight we have panelists from Australia and California and throughout all the time zones, and we're so happy you're all here. As we've changed phases from staying at home to opening for curbside pickup to again admitting customers into our 4 locations, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. I'll post links to buy the Shirley Hazzard collection as well as the panelists' books in the chat. And now I will stop begging and we will begin our Shirley Hazzard celebration. I'm delighted to introduce the panelists. Brigitte Olubas is a professor of English at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. She is Shirley Hazzard's authorized biographer and recently edited Hazzard's We Need Silence to Find Out What We Think, selected essays. Michelle de Kretser was born in Sri Lanka and lives in Australia. She is the author of 5 acclaimed novels, and her essay on Shirley Hazzard was published by Catapult in March this year. She now lives in Sydney with her partner, the poet and translator Chris Andrews. And Robert Pogue Harrison is the Rosina Pieriotti Professor of French and Italian Literature at Stanford University and the host of the Untitled Opinions podcast. He's the author of Juvenescence, A Cultural History of Our Age, and Gardens, an essay on the human condition, among other books, and a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. He was a close friend of Shirley Hazzard's, and he lives in California. We are presenting this event in partnership with the Columbia Rare Book and Manuscript Library. So I will pass things along now to Melina Moe.
Thank you, Maris. Hello, my name is Lena Moe, and I'm the curator of literature at Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library. I'm so happy to be included in tonight's event and to represent the institution where Shirley Hazzard's papers are held. In one of my first weeks at the library, I was shown the floor where the problem archives are kept. Among hundreds of shelves, there are a couple dozen boxes of papers, correspondence, books, and notebooks that were delivered from Shirley Hazzard's apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan after the author's death. They embodied an energetic researcher's dream, as well as what my colleague Jane, in charge of keeping track of the physical collections, would probably sketch out as a nightmare. They are bursting with uncatalogued materials, from which another of tonight's speakers, Brigitte, has already pulled some unpublished lectures and stories. A floor away, in the inner stacks of the library, there is another collection of neatly organized and easily researchable materials. These also belong to Shirley Hazzard's papers. They are the ones that were donated before her death and were selected and partly organized by the author herself before being delivered to the library and processed by a Columbia archivist. Hazzard's papers are both a gem and a mess, some parts carefully described and others given terse, unhelpful labels like assorted manuscripts. They promise to reward scholarly attention and close reading. It's not an unusual situation for an archive, but it seemed to me an oddly apt embodiment of the clarity as well as the trickiness of Hazzard's writing. Columbia's Rare Book Library is home to a remarkable collection of literary archives, but it is perhaps best known for its publishers' papers, including the troves of Random House and the New Press, among others. Tonight's event, of course, puts in close proximity the literary institutions of special collections and active publishing houses, as well as booksellers. McNally Jackson, thank you for hosting, and please take note. Hazzard was an active participant in the initial donation of her papers, and though New York was an important cultural location for her and for her husband, Francis Stiegmuller, whose papers are also at Columbia, Hazzard was careful that the papers relevant to her extensive network of Australian writer friends were sent to repositories there. As I said, the archive at Columbia is in two parts. The early part of the archive that is so well detailed rather appropriately contains her dissection of what she saw as the bureaucratic cruelty of the UN, where she worked as a younger person. The latter part included more of the literary and personal papers she was likely not yet ready to part with. I went through some of these most recent boxes of material in March, the last moments working in the library in before times, and saw correspondence, some volumes from her own library, including a touching series of tiny books, such as a miniature copy of French medieval tales inscribed to her by Francis at Christmas, perhaps a ritual between the two writers, in which he wrote that he thought it would fit perfectly on her tiny shelf, the inscription now conjuring a lost shared domestic space that the two writers inhabited in various spots across the globe: London, Naples, New York. Also in the boxes are dozens of what at first appearance look like address books, slim, leather bound with light gold on the edges, the same format over decades, like something that one could purchase at the Severe Smythson store on Madison Avenue or in Bond Street. They are palm-sized notebooks that could disappear in the hand, concealed perhaps while Hazzard took notes in an almost, to me, illegible script. The experience of looking at these made me feel like I was eavesdropping on something intensely private or leaning towards something being held slightly out of reach, a quality that I also associate with many of the women in Hazzard's fiction. And yet Brigitte, who is speaking next, has, as I've said, unearthed many notebooks and even manuscripts from the collection. She has also taught me a lot about the archive. I've described Hazzard's papers at Columbia as a challenge, maybe even somewhat chaotic, but they are also ready to be explored, and there is much, I'd wager, to be discovered. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think it's over to me now. Thank you so much, Lena and Maris, for this introduction, this opportunity. But first of all, I want to begin. In Australia, it is customary to begin public or formal events with what is called an acknowledgement of country. That is an acknowledgement of the Indigenous custodianship of the land. So I want to do this now briefly, quickly, on behalf of myself and also on Michelle's behalf, she's just up the road from me here. We are both joining you from the traditional lands of the Cadigal Wangal people of the Eora Nation. We wish to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and also to any other First Nations people who might be joining us here. And we wish to acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. It is a great pleasure to be here speaking to Michelle and Robert about the great Shirley Hazzard. I want to thank McNally Jackson, the Columbia Rare Book and Manuscript Library for hosting the event. And I want to thank Farrar Straus and Giroux, but also Virago in the UK and Hachette in Australia for producing this gorgeous book that is, so exciting to be here to talk about. So I'm going to begin by reading from one of the stories in this collection, and then we'll move on to some broader discussion. The story I've chosen is A Place in the Country, a story about a young woman, Nettie, who's been having an adulterous affair with Clem, who is her cousin May's husband. May has just found out about the affair, and Clem has arrived at Nettie's apartment to speak to her, and he begins by weeping in her arms. He raised his head and shifted his position so that he too leaned back on the sofa, although his shoulder was still pressed on hers. He held her right hand in his own, and with his left felt for his handkerchief and blew his nose. He closed his eyes, frowning, and she could see that he was studying how to begin. She tightened her clasp on his hand and said kindly, almost politely, "Don't worry, just tell me." He opened his eyes and sat up a little. "How good you are," he said. This struck her as the sort of compliment one pays to a child to encourage its behaviour in the desired direction. It comforted her not at all that her judgment of him should remain thus pitilessly detached, that she saw him perhaps more clearly and with less admiration than ever before. The insight was useless to her, trapped as she was in the circumstance of love. She knew that sitting there with her hands clasped about his and her eyes on his face, she represented accurately a spectacle of abject appeal. In any case, it was a habit of hers, possibly through the fear of loss, to appear most propitiating when she most condemned. Nothing has been decided, he said, putting away his handkerchief with a faint air of getting down to business. I can only tell you what we feel about it. At the word we, she lowered her eyes and kept them fastened to the design of interlocking fingers in her lap. Aware of having somehow blundered, he had already lost the place in his text. It was asking too much of her that she should prompt him. After a pause, he said abruptly, I think I told you I no longer loved my wife. Yes, she said. I only said that once, didn't I? Several times, she answered, unaccommodatingly. Several times then, he agreed with a touch of impatience. In any case, I can see now that I shouldn't have said that. I mean that it wasn't true. She thought that the digressions in the minds of men were endless. How many disguises were assumed before they could face themselves? How many justifications made in order that they might simply please themselves? How dangerous they were in their self-righteousness, infinitely more dangerous than women who could never persuade themselves to the same degree of the nobility of their actions. What are you thinking about? He asked her. Men, she said, absently. Taken aback by the plural, he stopped to assemble his thoughts once more. She was not being very encouraging, lowering her eyes and offering him monosyllables in this way. But there was no reason why she should encourage him, and he reminded himself of that. He was nothing if not fair. Why did you say it then? She looked up briefly. If it wasn't true. He said slowly, I thought it was true when I said it. I'm trying to say that I don't feel quite the same. I mean, not as I did. She was silent, watching her fingers uncurling from his and the tiny white dots on her blue dress waver with the trembling of her knee. The words seemed so loud that she thought their echo could diminish only over a lifetime, would go on sounding within her forever. Not as I did, not as I did. I would always care about you, he went on, now anxious to be understood, as it were, once and for all. But it can't be as it was. I'd like to think we can go on being fond of one another, that you can think of me as someone who, he paused for a moment and then continued, unconscious of irony, who showed you what love is. He withdrew his hand from her slackened grasp and lifted her chin so that she looked at him. Darling, please try to understand. I do understand, I do really, she said earnestly, almost in a tone of reassurance. It's only that I cannot bear it. So I was drawn to this passage, first of all, as a biographer. The story and the passage in particular draw very closely on Shirley Hazzard's youthful diaries, the ones that are held in Columbia there. And the scene and some of the dialogue draws it quite explicitly from the recorded account of that, a similar event in the diaries. But of course, I was also drawn because of the qualities of the prose, that enormous and impossible vulnerability in the face or the circumstance, as she has it, of love. And alongside that, the pitiless detachment, the implacable, quite brutal assessment by the young woman of her lover, the detail and precision of her thinking as she finds him lacking, and the fact that that doesn't help what she's suffering. So in a way, that combination of profound sympathy, of shared hurt, and of trenchant criticism and sharp observation, that combination works, I think, as a kind of metonymy for what Shirley Hazzard does herself in her writing. And with that, I want to go to our guests to ask for their thoughts on maybe this passage or this story or the stories or all of Hazzard's work. So really, we just want to start talking about her writing. And I'll start by going to Michelle. Michelle, you've written beautifully about Shirley Hazzard's style. You've said she was a writer who honoured the sentence. Could you say a little bit more about that, about her sentences?
Yes, I will. I will speak about her sentences with great joy, but I will first just comment on something in that passage, which is the detail of the white dots on the blue dress. And that is such a Shirley Hazzard moment, the concrete detail which brings Nettie there to us on the page. It puts her on the page before us. You know, there's been a lot of very interesting and skillfully done, but sort of abstract analysis of in the conversation between these two. And then there is Nellie before us, trembling, and that wonderful word, the dots wavering, le mot juste, as always with Hazzard. So that's the first thing I would say. And then a general comment on the stories. What I notice in that passage, it's happened just before you start reading, is Clem has been crying, which is quite uncharacteristic actually, because usually in these stories, it is women who weep. And in fact, this story will end with Nettie weeping copiously. It always ends in tears in these stories. And young women weep and weep, and they are judged excessive and unreasonable by the men who have occasioned those tears. And throughout these stories, it seems to me that something that links them is this opposition between the world of feeling, the world of emotion, which swells up and cannot be contained, and the world of reason, the world that Hazzard describes elsewhere as the world of machinery and men, which condemns this upsurge of feeling that can't be contained. And Hazzard has various kinds of shorthand for this world of feeling. Sometimes it's simply love. Sometimes it's poetry. Poetry is this kind of shorthand for this world. She says somewhere that the world of reason can be overturned by a single line of poetry. And there is a story called Harold, in which a young man called Harold writes wonderful poetry. And among the audience listening to him read his poems are three more young men who are quite different from Harold. And the narrator tells us that it's possible that they too write poetry, but only within the bounds of fastidious reticence. And we know straight away that this is, in Hazzard's view, not very good poetry, because it is not poetry that is going to make us feel. And then another word that she uses for this world is sometimes very simply human. At some point she says, we are human beings after all, not rational ones. But what is interesting beyond all of that is that this argument, this defense of the world of feeling that cannot be contained is expressed in these sentences that are so precisely contained and regulated and controlled. So it generates a kind of pleasurable tension, I think, between what is being argued for and the way in which that argument is being expressed. I mean, do you want to cut to Robert now, or do you want me to talk more about sentences, or maybe we
Robert,
come
do you want to jump in, or what do you think, Robert?
Well, I'd like to say that, you know, I did not know Michelle's book on Shirley Hazzard, but until about 10 days ago, and it's just really an exquisite work of a tribute from one writer to another, and it's someone who considers himself a literary historian, and with all my colleagues in academia, it really, in a certain sense, puts us to shame for the kind of deadening work that we do in our analyses. This is a really beautiful book. So I don't have much to add to what Michelle has to say about the style and the sentences. I mean, whatever I say will kind of echo it, that she did have this extraordinary stylistic signature that was quite unique, with this kind of narrative discretion along with a terseness, and then these details, one of which Michelle drew attention to in the passage that you read from. And I do believe, that she fulfills that expectation that Conrad, very, that bar, very high bar that he put about the work of art, the written work of art has to justify itself word by word and sentence by sentence in order to do full justice to the visible world. And I find that this work of justification is always there when I read stories. Sometimes I'm not particularly interested in the plot or the characters for a while, and then I know that if I stick with the story, like The Place in the Country, which I read for the first time in preparation for today, there are these moments that are just make it all more. The one that Michel referred to, I if you don't mind, I'll read the context about we are human beings, not rational beings. Just a few sentences before that, where the protagonist has understood that this relationship with the married count is going to come to an end, and she says, "I know that I risk and wounded May, I have disturbed the balance. There is a balance in life, but not fairness. The seasons, the universe give an impression of concord, but it is order, not harmony, consistency, not sympathy. We suffer because our demands are unreasonable or disorderly. But if reason is inescapable, so is humanity. We are human beings, not rational ones." And it strikes me that so many of her stories are about a unreasonable demand that the characters make on situations. That I'm referring here to what Michel was saying about the upsurge of emotions or the upsurge of certain sentiments that just do not conjugate well with reality. Reality operates up on a different set of rules than love, certainly, because there is this drive and thirst for transcendence in the experience of love. And of course, the world is not there to accommodate and welcome these rather unruly expectations of a certain transcendence. So it's interesting to me the way Shirley places not only her stories within these almost impossible situations where her protagonist is coming up against the brutal fate of reality, but also her sentences. I think that her sentences negotiate a certain kind of, there's a self-control in the style. And at the same time, there are these moments where, without abandoning self-control, there is this élan, this kind of flourishing of expression, which does not withhold anything. And because I remember asking her once about Henry James and how much she might have been influenced and so forth, and she said more than once that Henry James, great author, etc., but in the final analysis, even with him, there's always something that's withheld. Yeah. And she didn't approve of that. And I think that she manages, on the one hand, to have a style of a withholding style that still at the same time gives itself generously.
Thank you. Thank you. She also said that she thought she was funnier than Henry James. And we might get back to that question of how funny she is a little bit later. Thank you, Robert. Thank you both. Michelle, did you want to pick up Robert's point about the sentences and take that a little further before we go?
Please, I love what Robert said. I love the quotation from Conrad that, the work of art must justify itself word by word, sentence by sentence. Of course, as a writer, I am drawn to Hazzard's sentences above all, I think. And I thought I would just read a couple of sentences from a story called Vittorio. And that's a Vittorio who is an elderly Italian man. There are the two sentences. His friends were of his own condition, men of cultivated minds, distinguished manners, and diminished circumstances. The possibility of worldly success had never, by them, been entertained. They conjectured only as to the form, their failure would take. Now, I have several things to say about those sentences. And the first is that they are very typical Hazzard sentences, but they are not showy sentences. And yet, let's look at the care with which they have been composed. So, in that first sentence, Vittorio's friends like him, men of cultivated minds, distinguished manners, and diminished circumstances. So the first thing I notice is the little ironic jolt that comes with diminished circumstances, because that's not necessarily what you would expect of men of cultivated minds and distinguished manners, but they are sadly of diminished circumstances. And then the second thing I notice is that tripartite construction, which of course brings Flaubert to mind. I'm sure it would for you, Robert. And Flaubert was, of course, a very important presence in Hazzard's life because of Stigmuller's interest in him. So the tripartite construction, with the third element, diminished circumstances, being the longest, which is what you find everywhere in Flaubert. So that's the first sentence. Then there's a second sentence, and I will read that again with the punctuation this time. So, the possibility of worldly success had never by then been entertained. Sorry, the possibility of worldly success had never, comma, by then, comma, been entertained, semicolon. They conjectured only as to the form their failure would take. So when we think of those two sentences, the two parts of that sentence, the first thing I would say is how beautifully they are poised. And this is true in general of Hazzard's sentences. They're rhythmically poised. And the very Latinate vocabulary, her vocabulary skews towards the Latinate, adds to what I would call, the majesty of her prose, its stateliness. And we see that in that very balanced sentence with its two halves. But the other thing, when we're thinking about the punctuation, I mean, the standard way of expressing that would be to say the possibility of worldly success had never been entertained by them. Well, not only is that rhythmically flat, but by changing the syntax, by setting by them off in a parenthesis with the use of the commas, it's more satisfying to the ear, but also it mirrors the way Vittorio and his friends are set apart from the rest of society, which is utterly preoccupied with worldly success. And then finally, I notice the stressed monosyllable with which it ends, the form their failure would take. So after all that Latinate vocabulary, take the final blunt monosyllable, and that stressed monosyllable at the end of a sentence, and here also at the end of a paragraph, gives a great air of finality to that sentence and to that portrait of these men. You hear the gavel coming down there. And these are not the showy sentences that Hazzard dazzles us with elsewhere, where there are wonderful metaphors. I mean, she's a virtuoso of figurative language, but these are just quite ordinary sentences, and your eye can glide over them, and does. But as soon as you start to look at them in detail, you just see the care with which they are composed. And that's why I love Hazzard's sentences.
Thank you. It's beautiful. Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to stop now and just go off and read, but we'll persevere. Moving from the sentences now to the substance, I suppose, and back, as always, to the question of love. I want to ask Robert to talk a little bit more about that. And just as a kind of stimulus, I'm going to draw a passage, a quote from Shirley Hazzard. So from an interview you did, Robert, with her in the winter, I think, of 2006, that can be listened to on your Entitled Opinions podcast. And you were talking about clothes and the metaphorics of clothes, but you move on to the question of the X-ray in Transit of Venus. So the X-ray comes up when Grace, the second sister, and the doctor, Dr. Dance, and they fall in love as they are looking at the X-rays of Grace's son, who has an illness. And she just wants to talk about the X-rays. And so I'll just quote a little bit from what she says. She says, most of all, those X-rays are about mortality. She says, when Grace is shown those X-rays of her son, she's thinking of his mortality. She is brought close to the fact that this is a view of a skeleton. And you see, this is a new thing that came into our lives only in the past century. Before X-ray, no one had seen a skeleton unless the person had died. Skeletons do remind one of mortality, memento mori. This is a modern experience, one that hasn't been had before, and I wanted to bring this into play. When their hands meet, I hope that one is at that moment seeing the bones. I have prepared the ground that it's their bones that are meeting, because they are, in that moment, aware of mortality. Now that is a stunning comment. It is of a piece with the larger movements of the novel. Death is everywhere, to be found alongside love, particularly with Caro, and of course in other novels. But Robert, I want to ask you to comment on that image of death in love, of the bones meeting, and also of that uncanny twinning of the modern and the ancient in this passage, and in her work more broadly.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary moment where you have Grace and the doctor coming together on what is an X-ray. I mean, Shirley was right to draw attention to how revolutionary is this technology that sees through the flesh. And in this novel, I was asking her about the role that clothing plays, because so much of the characters are associated with their clothing. And there's this moment at which the lead, Caro, the sister of Grace, gets undressed, but she never gets fully undressed. She has a little bracelet or a watch on in the one moment where she's denuded. But then you realize through the technology of the X-ray that, the X-ray can go through what we take to be the flesh of the naked self into the skeletal, structure. And I was asking Shirley whether her writing, whether on a psychological level, she does do something like a radiography of the soul, of the character, of the personalities, because she does have a way of probing deeply inwardly. She brought it back to the actual literal thing about the bones, and because when they touch their hands, the bones, she wants the reader to see that it's the skeletal, it's what is mortal in them that is bringing them together, which is beautiful. However, what happens in that scene when Grace is remembering it, she remembers that the doctor comes and says that it's just like Paolo and Francesca. Now, Paolo and Francesca is a reference to Canto 5 of Dante's Inferno, which is the great love aria of Francesca, where she tells Dante that they were, she and her brother-in-law were reading a book one day for pleasure, and they were reading about the romance of Lancelot, and the reading, they kept exchanging glare, they were blushing and so forth, but that it was one point alone that kind of overpowered us. It's when we read about how Lancelot kissed Queen Guinevere, and that was when Paolo put down the book and he kissed me, his mouth all trembling. Galeotto was the book and he who wrote it. Galahad was the go-between. And for that doctor to say that this X-ray is serving the purpose of a Galahad, as if in Inferno 5, this just shows you just how learned and erudite and discreet at the same time is Shirley, who knows that what Francesca says is that an ultimate heroic love has to consummate itself in death. She says, amor ci conduce a una morte. Love led us to one death. And if you think of the Italian, una morte is one death, but it actually contains the etymon of amor. If you put the last A of una with the word morte, so one death. And so the conjunction of love and death in the Paolo and Francesca canto, I think, is underlying that whole scene in a way that you would really not notice at a cursory reading of it. And I think Shirley did believe that the disruptive power of love that we were speaking about earlier has some world hostility. And if you believe people like Denis de Rougemont, Love in the Western World, our most beautiful love stories end in a kind of heroic death of Tristan and Isolde, it's Romeo and Juliet, it's Paolo and Francesca themselves. And perhaps it's that ultimate impossibility of this wild expectation of transcendence that creates this strong correlation between love and death.
Yeah, thank you. And you've also given such a wonderful exercise, as Michelle did at the level of the sentence, but this, the level of the phrase or the image of just how much is embedded in every word, in every line of these stories of the novels, and that which is of course part of the genius of Hazzard. Robert, if I can stay with you for a minute, I want to ask you also to talk about a bit about her relationship to the past. She was so wedded to the past, and again, just as a stimulus, a beautiful comment she made. This is from a letter, again, one of the letters held at Columbia, a letter to her friend Donald Keene, the scholar of Japanese literature, and she was writing to him on the death of another of her friends, the Italian scholar Roberto Pane. And she said that on the occasion of Pane's 90th birthday, he was asked in an interview what he thought was his own most important quality. Such a good question to be asking. And he gave the answer, and she uses his Italian word, coerenza. And she explains that in the Italian sense, this has a sense of consistency and a sort of integrity of persistence, as well as having our own sense of clarity. And she says, Pane also said of his life's dedication to art and architecture, I will defend with my last breath the memory of the human past. Now, these seem to be qualities she values in herself, in others, this integrity of persistence, the clarity and the defense of the memory of the human past. You knew her talking about the past, you knew her in Italy above all. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So with Shirley, conversations were predominantly were just permeated with references to the past. It could be personal past, it could be historical past, or even something deeper. And I think that so I know in Michelle's book on Shirley Hazzard, at a certain point, Michelle says that history at a certain point in her career becomes the matter of her fiction. It's about history. And it's true that history is something that has its dynamism, is ever changing. But one thing about the past I'd like to say about from my personal friendship with Shirley is her devotion to what we might call the setting of history, or the decor of the stage of history, which if you think of Greek amphitheaters, for example, they're kind of carved into the mountain, and they're looking out over the earth and the sea and the sky. And that decor was assumed to be permanent. And whatever is happening on stage is taking place within this context of permanence. Now we know that the setting is under severe threat of convulsion through our ecological thing. But leaving that aside, I think that Shirley was so committed to the permanence of a context of history. And I'll give you one anecdote. When she would always stay at the Hassler Hotel for decades. She was staying there. She had a little room. She got a big, significant discount. And the restaurant we would mostly go to is called Otello in Rome. And it's just a walk down the steps. And then there's a set of side steps that go up to the top of the Spanish steps in Rome. And I remember coming back from dinner, walking her up there, and we were talking about something, and I mentioned something about change. The only time I ever heard her use the word hate was when she stopped in the middle of a stair, and she said, "I hate change." And it was very heartfelt, and then somehow a quote from Hölderlin came to my mind from his preface to Hyperion, which I've known by heart since I was maybe even a teenager. And I quoted to her, it said, Hölderlin saying, "On no account do I wish it were original. Original is novelty for us, and nothing is as dear to me as nothing is as dear to me as the world itself, or nothing is as dear to me as the world itself." Yeah.
And if Shirley were here, she'd supply that last line, of course.
Oh, she didn't supply it because somehow that took her by surprise, and it was a moment I could see her deliquesce in terms of identification with the sentiment that it was this commitment to the non-novel, but not in the sense that she was rejecting history, because history is always moving into novel and there's always new things happening. She was, I agree with Michelle, that her matter was really about the historical. But what she loved about Naples above all is that were Virgil to sail into the Bay of Naples today, he would recognize it as basically completely unchanged from the time when he would do it 2,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it's the fact that it had not changed, and that's the thing that made Naples, very exceptional, even among the landscapes of places like Tuscany and so forth. Yeah, so I think that the human past became a great source of alleviation of loneliness and of not feeling isolated, even because from an early age, turning to poetry, the whole tradition of literature, and finding that someone all of a sudden like Hölderlin is he is your blood brother, Shakespeare, your blood brother. The past is the the living creative foundation for her being in the world.
Thank you. Thank you. We're getting to the end of our time, but I want to ask Michelle if you would speak a little bit, perhaps not about the past, but about the contemporary world in Hazzard's writing, in particular about bureaucracy and office work. Like you, she felt that office work and bureaucracy were neglected, and she wrote to Patrick White, this central and dominant theme of modern life has yet to find its interpreter of genius. The 19th century, we had Dickens and Balzac, they made an excellent beginning, then it was dropped in horror. And you say beautifully, work in fiction belongs to police officers, also to the honest toil of manual labour, and lament, as Shirley does, that we don't see enough of bureaucracy and office work. And I wonder if you could say a little more about that.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Robert, for that beautiful description of conversation with Hazzard. I do think that the stories collected in People in Glass Houses, the UN stories, are Shirley Hazzard's confrontation with modernity. I mean, the Cliffs of Fall is, has superb stories in it, but to me, that collection is of its time. The decor is unchanged there. I think it's the middle of the 20th century. Whereas, I devoured People in Glass Houses in the 1990s, and it seemed to me to exactly reflect my own experience of officers at the time. You know, the hideous, stupid, pompous, arrogant, continue as you wish, men at the top. The young women occupying lowly positions who, by virtue of being young women, are treated with contempt. And everyone in between, you know, she gives us this complete array of types that I think continue to populate every workplace. You know, there's the cynic, the fatalist, the bully, the gossip, the manipulator, and also the idealist, the good people, the decent people, memorably described as those of crushable substance. Those of crushable substance. But, you know, it seemed to me when I read those stories that I had never read anything like it. And I hadn't. You know, Hazzard is quite right to point out that, you know, the office work had not yet found its genius. I think it did in her. But I also, linking to Robert's point about the persistence of the past, I think that when I read those stories, and, you know, I read them, I think, for the 4th or 5th time in preparation for this talk, and it's only just now that I've realized that, of course, they are not without precedent, because art very rarely is entirely without precedent. And there was a writer, a famous writer, a great writer, who wrote about the world of absurd, obscure, labyrinthine, iron regulations, and the hapless individuals who find themselves up against those regulations. And that writer was, of course, Kafka. And reading these stories this last time, you know, yes, Hazzard is very different. She's working in a realist mode. She's not working with allegory in the way that Kafka is, but I could see his coattails flicking around the corners of those corridors of the organization. And you can disagree, but you know, the echo of the past, the shadow of the past. I don't know whether Hazzard had read Kafka at that time. Brigitte, you would know. You know everything about her.
Don't know.
But
I think it's
something, you know, every time I read her, I find something new.
Certainly that sense of just the absence of an outside and the horror of that, which for her in People in Glass Houses goes on being comic. It becomes bearable, I suppose, by virtue of the comedy.
It's very funny, you laugh on every page, but it's also deeply tragic. Yeah. It's also deeply tragic. Yeah. Because the waste and the gulf between the stated aim of the organization, its humanitarian aims, and the way it actually treats people. Yeah. So, you know, that unbridgeable gulf.
Amazing. Yes, thank you. Another wonderful insight, one to ponder, I think. As we are at the end, I think, and ready for questions, I wonder if I could just read one more thing from Hazzard, another little snippet from her letters. And I wanted to end with this in the current context, really, where we are, particularly in the US at the moment, and just to think about her political engagement. And this follows naturally on from the points Michelle's just been making about the real world of work and the criticisms and so on of that. I mean, yes, she wrote those works on the United Nations, and, you know, I'll just put those aside, because her political engagement's not confined to that. She was very much engaged by contemporary politics. Her correspondence is full of discussions of US politics, Australian politics, local Italian politics, down to, you know, stuff about the Capri, the way Capri is kind of administered at a municipal level. It's this energy for contemporary politics. But the passage I want to read is from December 1975. And it's from a letter she wrote to the Australian novelist Elizabeth Harrower, who was her good friend or frenemy over many decades. And Harrower had just written to Hazzard to tell her of, well, I think Hazzard had seen reports in the news of the 1975 election, which every Australian here will know, the election of a Conservative government led by Malcolm Fraser to replace the very progressive government that had been led by Gough Whitlam, that had a month before been dismissed by the unelected head of state in a constitutional crisis. So it was a devastating move, and the shock election of the Conservatives in the wake of all of that. So, and she goes on to make some larger and I think very resonant for us today, very resonant observations about governments and elections and electors and questions of truth. So she wrote this: the election result, the 1975 Australian election result, vividly recalled Nixon's 1972 landslide, by which I mean a deliberate, self-destructive election by a population of a group that will bring out the worst in them. Something that has been very hard for me to realise, brought home to me by Vietnam, is the colossal indifference of people generally to evil. I used to think if you could bring the truth home to people, they would mostly care. I'm afraid I don't think that any longer. The truth of Vietnam was brought home day after day, year after year to Americans, and they did not care. They don't care now either, and have simply expunged it from their minds. Some of this seems to be in the Fraser-Whitlam result. They're kind of devastating words for all of us. I don't know, Robert and Michelle, if you want to, picking up on those questions about history, politics and truth, if there's any last thing you want to say, or if we'll throw open to questions from others.
I'd like to say that first thing, drawing attention to the piece that you published recently yourself in the Paris Review, where you talk about the role of truth, or the commitment to truth in Shirley Hazzard's, not only her political views, but also as a writer. And I think I'm taking a quote from that piece of yours of hers: there is at least one immense truth which we can still adhere to and make central to our lives: responsibility to the accurate word. And I think that Michelle also refers to this often in her book, about how there's a kind of moral, ethical, and even political responsibility to the proper, not the proper use of language, but an accurate, exact, le mot juste. Michel referred to Flaubert earlier, this idea that there is an exact word for the particular sentence. And she says that there is some way in which the good and rightful tears of the reader are drawn simultaneously by an emotion evoked through literature and by the experience of seeing a word in the right place. And this abuse of language, the complete the de-verification of the currency within which we are trafficking, at least at this particular moment in this republic of ours here in America, where truth and also as what she refers to as the colossal indifference to truth, where you can get almost half of the people to elect or re-elect, or almost re-elect someone who has no regard for truth whatsoever. And I think that barbarism begins with the devaluation of truth. I think Shirley understood that very well, politically speaking. And for her, literature, I think, was also a vocation of bringing out, revealing the truth in the most local ways that would resound, in ever larger horizons of relevance.
Thank you. Absolutely. Wonderful. Okay, I'm done, I think. Maris.
Yeah, I think we have one question, which is from Mary Ellen. And she wants to know, at the risk of sounding culturally reductive, is there anything recognizably Australian about Hazzard's writing?
Oh, yes, no. Okay, I'll take the no line for a minute. Beyond the fact that, well, Michelle has written beautifully about this, so I think she's probably the right person, but I would say the mere fact of writing about Australia, is you know, speaks to the fact, you know, and she represents Australia in extraordinary detail and extraordinary depth, I think, even though it is only a fleeting setting. Michelle, did you want to say more about that?
No, not really. I mean, there is the Australian content, of course, Australian characters, but I would say also, I mean, that she's writing always as an outsider. She's a woman, so in that sense, outside patriarchy, but also, you know, she is Australian in the UK, still a position in which one is open to denigration. The awful man, Christian, in The Transit of Venus, says of the two Australian sisters, they seem to be scarcely conscious of being Australians in a rented flat. You know, one should always be conscious of this and apologize for it. And then, of course, you know, in the States, she was a double outsider there. So I think that, you know, that kind of Antipodean vision of seeing things from the underside of power always stood her in good stead as a writer.
Except in relation to Australia, where her criticisms of Australia earned her, you know, great criticism in return, that she was not forgiven for being critical about Australia.
Oh yes, but it stood her in good stead as a writer. I mean, the opinions of some very stupid man, I mean, who cares really, you know, the work stands. You know what I'm talking about, Brigitte.
I do, I agree, yes.
You know, she will never be forgiven for having left Australia and not having come back. But that's our problem, not hers, really.
Can I make just one brief comment on this? Because we circulated an announcement about this event to a few of the book club, and Dana Joy, who's a former NEA chair and a California poet laureate, was so happy to see that we were going to be discussing Shirley Hazzard. And I think it's interesting, he writes, I wonder if part of her obscurity is that, like the equally superb Sybil Bedford, Hazzard was so international. She lived in Australia, New Zealand, Italy, and the US. She doesn't fall neatly into either Australian or American literature.
Yes.
And I wonder if there's something about, I think, Michelle, you say that she was expansive, she was outward, whereas Australia is inward looking as a rule, and our Australian writers are expected to be inward looking. She was very much going cosmopolitan, and cosmopolitanism, I think, even becomes a kind of battle cry for her.
Mm-hmm. I think she reminds me of Mavis Gallant in that sense, you know, the Canadian writer, wonderful, wonderful writer who spent most of her life in France. And I think, you know, is regarded with a certain ambivalence in Canada to this day because of that. Again, that international cosmopolitan perspective, the outsider's view.
And of course, she only, not speaking about her writing here, but about herself, she only ever she finally felt at home in Italy, in Capri in particular, where she was made an honorary citizen. There is a sense of a constructed home as a kind of retrospective project that she enacts, that's her real home. That's where she felt she really came from, rather than Australia. There are a couple more questions.
Yeah. Let's take, Alan writes, would any of the speakers like to comment on Shirley Hazzard's extraordinary powers of memorization?
Robert, I think.
Yeah, well, you know, hours and hours. I don't think there was a sonnet of Shakespeare's that she could not recite, you know, by heart, and Italian poetry, Montale in Italian, Leopardi, Thomas Hardy, completely in love with Thomas Hardy's later poems, and it was just an endless stream of memorized lines, and you didn't even have a sense that they were memorized. You just had a sense that they had been incorporated and made part of her flesh and blood, and that they were just coming out almost spontaneously. So, and I think her friendship with Graham Greene, someone had just sent out a chat about what about her friendship with Graham Greene. I think it began, or at least I think from what I read, he took notice of her for the first time because he was trying to remember a line from Robert Browning, and she just provided it for him on a plate, out of the blue.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
for a final question, Ishrat says, what in Hazzard's crystalline prose would describe this, our moment in time and history?
I wonder if we would go back to the inexpressible that Michelle writes about here. Or I suspect she would. So looking through her library books, her editions of Auden and of Byron are annotated. She's sort of written it in pencil, and the commentary, well, then it's not really a commentary, but she's writing things like Waldheim or Nixon next to passages of political criticism and commentary by both Auden and Byron. And I think it would be, her line would be something from Byron, probably some savage account of monstrousness in the public sphere along those lines.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah. She would have the quotation that none of us do, lacking her erudition.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been a real pleasure. And please, the link to buy the book is in the chat, and stay safe and be well and buy books.
Thank you. And thanks so much for running this, Maris. It's wonderful.
Thank you all. Thank you, Rita, above all, for a wonderful job you did editing this collection.
Thank you. It was a joy, of course, and a privilege. Okay.
Take care.
So much.